Beginning transmission. This is the Chaos Community Broadcast, a show about failures and how to navigate complex socio-technical systems so you can surf the chaos instead of succumbing to it. For recording of this broadcast, as well as all of our previous broadcasts, type in chaos.community into a web browser of your choice. I'm your host, James Wickett.
And I'm your host, Casey Rosenthal.
Well, today we are continuing our series on the book Chaos Engineering, System Resiliency in Practice. And with us today, we have a contributing author, Jason Cahoon, who wrote the chapter, Google DIRT, Disaster Recovery Testing. Jason is a site reliability engineer at Google, and he's also, what I understand, a very good chess player. Welcome to the show.
You got that part wrong anyways. A pretty laughably bad chess player.
Casey's always telling me about how he's a really good chess player. In fact, that's how he sees these episodes. He says he's always playing chess while the guests are playing checkers. So, we're really glad to have you.
All right, well, I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm really happy to have you here. I've been using Google to dig up dirt on my coworkers for years, so I'm glad you finally turned that into a framework. And congratulations on being published in the book. I'm not sure if this is your first time being published, but did you get the sticker pack?
No, I didn't get the sticker pack. I got my my copies of the book, which I was really appreciative to have. No, my first time, yeah, that'd be great. It was first time being published, and it was a really interesting experience. I don't know if I'd be chomping at the bit to go do it again. It was a lot of work, like more than I thought it would be when we got into it. And it's kind of like I got into this line of work because I didn't like writing essays and doing that sort of thing. And this really felt like homework at a point, but it was still fun, and it was kind of neat to have my name out there on an O'Reilly book, and with such cool and interesting other contributing authors and primary authors on this one. So.
Yeah, I hope the feedback you've gotten has been positive. Certainly on our end, we've heard very good things about the reception of your chapter. Could you start by telling us, so what is, I know Google is a search engine. Is that you're just primarily a software company?
Yeah, well, Google has a lot of engineers working for them, and they write a lot of code. I don't know if our statistics on like just how many lines of code, just as a dumb metric, get output there in a given week, day, month, whatever. But I can just leave it at it's freaking massive. Like really, really, really large amount of code being churned out, projects being worked out at Google. So really, we are a software company. It's the engineering is what drives every aspect of the business.
So, and you're there in Mountain View?
Yeah, I worked in Mountain View for a while in Sunnyvale, which is right next to Mountain View.
When I was first out in that part of the country, that was known as the Valley of Heart's Delight, known in particular for its orchards, apricots in particular, probably the most fertile soil in the country at the time. Californians must be prescient because they paved it all over to trap the nutrients in the dirt. Speaking of dirt,
the whole valley used to be like fruit trees, and now it's just fruit cakes, I guess. Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about the DIRT framework at Google, not the soil?
Yeah. So DIRT is a program that's been run at Google, started by these senior engineers and system administrators long before I ever showed up on the scene. And it is what the rest of the world calls chaos engineering. And the idea was that if you really want a reliable system, you have to understand what its failure modes are. You have to actually have witnessed it misbehaving, so you can be sure that you know how to deal with it, and that the way you've anticipated it not working is actually the way that it doesn't work under some circumstances. So what Google engineers started to do was have these like week-long events where they would encourage teams to break things on purpose, but in a very scrutinized and meticulous way. So there's a lot of planning that goes into these intentional breakages. And when the time came to actually, execute any given breakage scenario that someone had cooked up, it would be monitored very, very carefully and analyzed, like while the system was in this state. And we take that kind of information and then go use it to make the whole system more reliable, make it better.
So at this point, my preference for personal reasons would be if Google adopted the language of chaos engineering. So I don't know what we could do to make that happen. But one of the reasons I was so excited to have this included in the book is that because you used a different name, it's almost like a similar practice was evolved in an isolated environment. So whereas we created when we defined chaos engineering and wrote the principles at principlesofchaos.org, I mean, we were literally sitting in a room and brainstorming the best practices as far as we could introspect. Whereas you came up with rules of engagement, and I'd like to just outline them because I think it's an interesting contrast to the principles. There's a few here, but DIRT tests must have no service level objective breaking impact on external systems or users. So this is kind of analogous to the minimizing the blast radius. But that's a directive to make sure that you're not actually breaking things in production. Again, you're focusing on discovering unknown behaviors. Another one is production emergencies should always take precedence over DIRT. Quote emergencies, which totally makes sense. Production is where the business value is. That you run DIRT tests with transparency. James knows I'm not a particular fan of transparency. I like surprises, but
yep, he does.
But that makes a lot of sense in a large organization like Google. And then minimize cost, maximize value. And then the last one is treat disaster tests as you would actual outages, which is something that I don't think is captured in the principles definition of chaos engineering, and that's I think there's a lot of value in that. How do you be transparent that you're running a DIRT test and also ensure that people are reacting to it the same way that they would in an actual outage?
Oh, we really have to hammer that point in like over and over and over again. So those guidelines are there as sort of guiding principles that we use to help people understand what the motivations of disaster testing are, as well as like help them design their tests. So it's a lot of outreach to engineers to get that point across. And when we run this week-long event, there's what we call a war room setup, where about a dozen or more people, some of like the best site reliability engineers at Google, all get together in a room that has these big visible dashboards up and like kind of mission control sort of equipment all over the place, so we can monitor what's happening around the company. And some people's inclination, when their email doesn't work during some of these tests, is to like try to get in touch with the DIRT, war room. And we have to remind them like, no, do what you would normally do, because normally the DIRT war room isn't here. We're here to watch and make sure that nothing catastrophic is going on, or be able to coordinate all the testing that's going on.
And so over time, have you found a way to reinforce the fact that you are doing the most important and interesting work at Google?
I've been trying to tell people that, but well, the thing is there's some
You mentioned the humanistic effect. Andy Fleener was on the show. He wrote a chapter on humanistic chaos. We had Adrian Cockcroft on the show, and he mentioned a rule he likes of telling organizations to have their tech lead go on vacation for at least 2-week periods to make sure that the pain of not having them around is felt. You mentioned in the chapter, you have an outtake, an example of code search breaking when the tech lead goes on vacation, and people outages when developers aren't available at conferences and things like that. So you do dirt experimentation on organizational elements. Having people out of or taking people out of the picture for certain events. Is there a way you could construct an experiment to reinforce the value of dirt itself? Like maybe remove your team, and then I'm not sure if Google has ever experienced an outage, but then like you could, maybe Gmail stops working. I don't know.
Yeah.
It happened a few weeks ago. I think that the real life situations, there's this thing that we call the dirt curse. I think I actually mentioned this in a sideline on the book. The dirt curse is when someone suggests a test that seems so risky that people start waving their hands and wave the white flag before the thing even kicks off, and they say, all right, we don't want to do this. We need to evaluate more closely what the impact potentially will be, and maybe even try to solve some of the anticipated problems before we run the test. And so the dirt curse is when one of these tests comes through, there seems to be a thing where a couple weeks after this, basically the exact situation that someone described as a test just happens on its own organically. And it's a really eerie phenomena where we look at that and go, wow, like we called that was somebody identified that as like, this could really be a problem and a really annoying problem. And then on the receiving end, a bunch of teams go, yeah, you're right, let's not do that. And then it happens anyways, just on its own.
Manifest the vision of failure that you want to be in the world. That's powerful.
Yeah, be the failure you want to see.
We often run into organizations that haven't experienced chaos engineering yet, that come at it with an attitude of, oh, well, it sounds kind of risky. So maybe that's okay for a company that just works in entertainment, or in Google's case, online advertising, or technical conveniences. But we could never do chaos engineering in something like critical infrastructure
or healthcare.
Or healthcare, which I think is a very poor metaphor, especially healthcare, because we actually based chaos engineering on the pinnacle of Western experimentation, which is the clinical trial. Healthcare already does chaos engineering; they just call it something else, right? A randomized trial is basically a perfect chaos engineering experiment. But do you ever run into that? It sounds like maybe some of that mentality comes in for the form of pushback when people are disturbed by dirt tests. Do you ever run into that more generally outside of Google?
Wow, outside of Google, I don't know if I do anything outside of Google anymore.
Well, I'd like to talk about a way that people could get the book that we've been referencing. Jason, your chapter in there, as well as all the other chapters. Verica has sponsored the Chaos Engineering book that Casey, Nora, and a bunch of contributing authors have written, such as yourself, Jason. And for a limited time, we're giving that away, the full PDF of that, absolutely free. If you go to verica.io/book, you can get your copy, and you can read Jason's chapter as well as the rest.
I can actually hear it. That's the downloads.
What can you?
I can hear the downloads.
Okay.
Started.
That's you're having that again. All right.
Bring in the audience.
So I'd like to welcome our first caller to the show.
Hi, Jason, and thanks for taking my question. My question is, in your chapter in the Chaos Engineering book, you mentioned that engineering teams should re-architect rather than run dirt tests on fundamentally broken systems. However, sometimes those systems with lots of failures also appear to be great candidates to start doing dirt tests. So do you have any advice for engineering teams that might be trying to decide when to go back to the drawing board versus running chaos tests to make their system more robust?
That's a great question. And these are some of these nuanced situations that oftentimes take the team sitting down together and hashing this out. The point that I was trying to make with that particular part of the chapter was not to just be a jerk because you know you can be a jerk, right? If you know that system's broken and you know it's broken in this way, there's a proclivity to want to go and run a disaster test, do some chaos engineering testing that really hammers that point home and draws attention to the fact that it's broken by using pain as the alerting mechanism, so to speak. And I actually have examples within Google of where we have actually done that sort of thing with certain systems that were unsupported but still highly relied upon by a lot of people internally. And so I on the one hand, I'm saying like, don't do that. And the reason I'm saying that is kind of what we were just talking about with you're not going to make a lot of political allies acting in that fashion. At the same time, it could be worth doing because of how serious the problem is. It really depends on where you dial that in, and you want to double check yourself to see if others agree with you about the seriousness of that, because sometimes it can be easy to tunnel vision yourself and think a problem is a lot more egregious than it actually is. If you know what the problems are, try to fix the problems. If there's no need to call attention to this at company-wide scale for some reason, take the time that you would have used to plan out that dirt test and execute it, and try to do something constructive on the problem that you're already aware of. The dirt test you're not learning anything about your system if you already know that it's broken.
I'm bringing disaster recovery processes to my own organization, but I'm not sure what to call it. Does Google have a trademark on dirt?
No comment. I have no idea. Really fun to come on and talk to you both.
Yeah, well, Jason, we appreciate it. Folks, that concludes our show. For recording of this broadcast, as well as all of our previous broadcasts, remember you can go to chaos.community in the web browser of your choice. Jason, it's been lovely. Casey, about as usual. Ending transmission now.